Canto 1 of In Memoriam A.H.H. opens with an allusion to the multifaceted German genius Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. This is what the poet says. I quote, I held its truth with him who sings to one clear harp in diverse tones. Unquote. Goethe is easily the most appropriate figure alluded to through these lines. Goethe was a poet, a prose writer, a dramatist, an artist, a scientist, a letter writer, a diplomat, an administrator, and what not. He is looked upon as one of the greatest figures in the intellectual history of the Western world. And Goethe was a very famous man in his own lifetime. And it is almost certain that Tennyson fell under the shadow of Goethe's influence and decided to open In Memoriam A.H.H. with an allusion to Goethe. The poet agrees with Goethe that life is a constant opportunity to evolve into something better. The future is beyond prediction. What is loss and what is gain? Who can say? And sometimes one can find in loss a gain to match. The poet says that it is sweeter to be drunk with loss. The poet believes that it is better to experience sorrow and to go through sorrow, to go through the experience of sorrow thoroughly, completely, to allow oneself to be drenched in sorrow rather than to create a situation in which others are able to say that the speaker loved him, but now that he is dead and gone, he has forgotten his grief. There is the old Greek saying, whom the gods love, die young. The inspirational basis for In Memoriam A.H.H. is, of course, the untimely death of Arthur Henry Hallam. It was the first great shock in the life of Tennyson, a shattering blow from which he recovered only very slowly. The death of Hallam, who was destroyed ere his prime by fate, who was a close personal friend of the poet, who was engaged to the poet's younger sister, immersed the poet in grief. Tennyson is one of the greatest masters of melancholia in world literature. And some of the most beautiful lines, some of the most hauntingly beautiful lines on sorrow, on grief, on melancholy in English poetry are from Tennyson. I sometimes think that Tennyson really enjoyed his sorrow. He immersed himself completely in his grief, in his sorrow, and converted his sorrow into great poetry. Thus, the opening canto offers a kind of justification for the existence of the poem, for the creation of the poem. The allusion to Goethe at the very opening of the canto. What is one to make of it? It could be that the poet is seeking inspiration from Goethe, seeking the blessing of Goethe at the very beginning of his project. It could be that the poet is seeing Goethe as a sort of role model for himself. Goethe, the multifaceted genius, the poet, prose writer, dramatist, scientist, diplomat, administrator, letter writer. Above all, there is a subtext that had Hallam lived a full life, he might have evolved into a kind of Goethe himself. The second canto is the famous canto on the yew tree. We say that Wordsworth is a great nature poet. Of course he is. But I would say that Tennyson is also a great nature poet. In fact, his nature descriptions, Tennyson's nature descriptions are sometimes more accurate, more exact, more graphic, more based on actual observation than the nature descriptions of Wordsworth. A good exemplification of this is found in the canto under discussion. The yew tree is a typical English tree. In fact, it's called the English yew. The yew tree lives for hundreds, even thousands of years. I understand that there are yew trees in England and Scotland which are more than 2,000 years old. The yew tree is an evergreen tree. It's an evergreen coniferous tree. Its leaves and berries are poisonous. They can cause death. The yew tree is planted, or the yew tree is found very frequently in graveyards. There are dozens of yew trees in England which predate the 10th century. The yew tree is a remarkable source of timber. The timber of the yew tree was or is used widely in cabinet making. The yew tree, when the branches of the yew tree touch the ground, they sprout roots and regenerate themselves. Thus the yew tree can stand for many things. The yew tree was a holy tree for the pagans, and early Christianity frequently took over pagan holy sites and converted them into churches. And that is how in churchyards, in the graveyards attached to churches, we find yew trees. The poet says that gazing at the yew tree, he develops a sort of identification with the yew tree and becomes what the yew tree is. And gazing on thee, sullen tree, sick for thy stubborn hardihood, I seem to fail from out my blood and grow incorporate into thee. I think there is a sort of contrast between the first canto and the second canto. The first canto is all about grief, sorrow, pain, and the justification for immersing oneself in grief, sorrow, and pain. In the second canto, the poet gazes at the yew tree, longs for the hardness, the toughness, the insensitivity of the yew tree, the detachment of the yew tree, and develops a kind of complete identification with the yew tree. The yew is a very important symbol in Memoriam A.H.H. What does the yew stand for? It can stand for quite a few things. The yew, as I said, was a holy tree for the pagans. The yew stands for religion, which outlasts the lives of individuals. The yew stands for the divine. The yew stands for immortality. For the yew lives almost forever. It lives for thousands of years. The yew stands for death. You must remember that its leaves, its berries can cause death. The yew stands in the graveyard, and so the yew can symbolize death very appropriately, very effectively. The yew stands for nature. In his poem, The Brook, Tennyson says, if I remember correctly, men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Human life is limited. Human life is finite. Human life is brief. But nature has always existed and will always exist. Canto 3 is the lovely apostrophe, the famous apostrophe to sorrow. Tennyson is one of the greatest poets of sorrow in world literature and the greatest poet of sorrow in English literature after William Shakespeare. Tennyson and sorrow were no strangers. In fact, without much exaggeration, it can be said that Tennyson and sorrow were twin brothers. Tennyson had something like a dozen siblings. It was a large family, and the resources that could be provided to each child was meager. And at one point, the family was very much in debt. Tennyson's father was a clergyman who had absolutely no interest in his life as a clergyman. Tennyson's father had been disinherited by Tennyson's grandfather, a wealthy landowner, and this had made Tennyson's father very bitter, and he had developed a drinking problem and drug abuse problem. It is said that the poet and his brothers had to undergo a very abusive childhood. And the poet was very unhappy at school. All these experiences made an indelible impression on the little Alfred and helped him to develop into a very gifted poet of sorrow. The latest blow was the death of Arthur Henry Hallam, Tennyson's very dear friend, who died much before his prime during his continental tours. O sorrow, cruel fellowship! Sorrow offers a relationship, even a friendship, but it's a cruel relationship, a cruel companionship, a cruel fellowship. There is no doubt that sorrow is a sadist. The poet calls her, apostrophizes her as the priestess in the walls of death. The priestess in the walls of death. Death is the ultimate sorrow because it is a sorrow which cannot be overcome, it cannot be corrected. Death means you cease to exist. There is no return, there is no recovery. And thus death is the ultimate sorrow. And sorrow is the priestess in the walls of death. The poet says that sorrow is sweet and bitter in a breath. Perfectly captures the attitude of Tennyson, the approach of Tennyson to sorrow. Sweet and bitter. As I've already said, I suspect that Tennyson enjoyed sorrow, enjoyed pain, enjoyed grief, and converted his sorrow, his pain, his grief into golden poetry. Here, sorrow speaks of the stars weaving a web across the sky. And according to sorrow, nature, everything is phantom, is hollow, is meaningless. Sorrow explains that everything, including nature, everything in this universe is empty, hollow, phantom, in fact, absolutely meaningless. Everything is nothing. Thus, sorrow is here presented as a nihilist who believes that everything is nothing. As the canto moves towards its close, the poet calls sorrow blind. Sorrow is blind because it hits everyone. Nobody can escape the blow of sorrow. And it hits everyone without any rhyme or reason, without any logic, without any formula. It just hits individuals in a random fashion. Sorrow is certainly blind. The poet asks whether he should embrace her or crush her. Embrace her as my natural good, or crush her like a vise of blood upon the threshold of the mind. I think that the results will be the same. The results will be the same whether the poet embraces sorrow or crushes sorrow. Whether the poet embraces sorrow or crushes sorrow, the result is the same. The result is the production of a masterpiece. And the masterpiece is In Memoriam A.H.H. Canto 4 is about sleep. I would like to remind you that in English we have a long and rich tradition, a glorious tradition of poets down the generations, down the centuries, writing about sleep. The most famous sleep poems in the English language include Sonnet 39 of Philip Sidney, Sonnet 27. Let me try to recollect. Yes. Sonnet 27 of William Shakespeare, Golden Slumbers of Thomas Dekker, Cradle Song, Cradle Song of William Blake, To Sleep of William Wordsworth, To Sleep of John Keats, A Long, Long Sleep of Emily Dickinson, Asleep of Wilfred Owen, Lullaby of W.H. Auden, and How to Sleep of Philip Larkin. In the canto under discussion, the poet says that he gives himself up to sleep. To sleep I give my powers away. Obviously it is night. Night is beginning. And the poet's will becomes a bondsman, a slave to sleep. And sleep, you must remember, is a rudderless boat, a hemless bark. We don't know where it is going. Thus the poet surrenders himself completely to sleep. The poet wonders why his heart is so broken, why he is in such low spirits. The explanation is that he has lost something. He has lost something precious. He has lost something which gave him joy, happiness, pleasure in his early years. And that is why he has no option but to surrender to sleep. But when morning comes, the speaker reverses his position. He says that he shall not be the fool of loss. He shall not allow himself to be completely overcome by grief, to be completely overcome by sleep, which acts as a balm to his sorrow. The speaker's will asserts itself, and he declares that he will overcome. In the fifth canto, the poet wonders whether it is a sin to express one's own grief. I sometimes hold it half a sin to put in words the grief I feel. It is certainly embarrassing, certainly unseemly, certainly somewhat indecent to keep on talking about one's grief. Besides, words cannot fully express one's grief because words half reveal and half conceal the soul. However, the poet admits that there is a very good use in words. When you put in words, especially when you put in verse, in measured language, your pain, the operation acts as a drug. It is a kind of narcotic which dulls the pain, which soothes the pain by writing about his grief. At least to some extent, the poet is able to control his grief, to overcome his grief. I think Tennyson is here speaking of poetry as therapy. You must remember that Tennyson lived long before the age of confessional poetry. But there is a very strong confessional strain. There is a very strong confessional element in Tennyson's poetry, especially in Memoriam A.H.H. The poet says that the very act of expressing his grief through poetry benumbs the grief by reaching out to his readers, by putting across to his readers through his poetry, his sorrow, his grief. The poet is able to overcome, at least to some extent, his sorrow, his grief. So the poet decides to wrap himself up in words as if they were weeds. In words like weeds, I wrap me o'er. The word weed has many meanings, as in the case of most words in the English language. Weed can mean unwanted plant. Weed can mean cannabis. There was a time when I was smoking weed. It can also mean garment, especially when used in the plural form. The widow's weeds are the black garment that a widow wears to signify that she is in mourning, she has gone into mourning. I think it's very deliberately that the poet here uses weeds because weeds are usually associated with widows and mourning. However, the poet warns us that the words that follow, the poems that follow, the lines that follow, the cantos that follow do not capture fully the grief that he feels. They capture only the outline and not anything more. The grief of the poet, the sorrow of the poet is so profound, is so intense, so piercing that no words can convey them. And the words that follow that convey or attempt to convey the grief of the poet succeed only in conveying it very partially.